Thank you. Thank you, Peter, very much indeed, and I hope you can all hear me clearly. Thank you for that very kind and warm welcome. It's great to be here, particularly great because I first planned to come here a year ago, in the fall of 2020. It got postponed to February. It got postponed again, and this time I've made it. So third time lucky. It's really nice to be here. Thank you so much for your welcome. And I published this book during the first lockdown. I recorded the audio version in my linen closet at home, surrounded by duvets to deaden the sound. And it's not a great time to publish a book. You can't really whiz around the world telling people about it, so it all got a bit delayed. But the reason I wrote it was because I touched on the topic of innovation in previous books. It kept coming up as a theme in the background. And I just thought to myself, I'm not sure I fully understand this creature called innovation. What is it? Why does it happen to us and not to rabbits or rocks? You know, why does it happen when and where it does, and not so much in other places and things like that? So I set out to explore the phenomenon of innovation as if I was a Martian who'd just arrived on the planet and wanted to understand it. And some of the things I've come back with will be really obvious to you, particularly if you've got this wonderful course on innovation and entrepreneurship here. But some of them may surprise you, I think, but it's an idiosyncratic view of the topic. And my starting point is this object, which sits on my desk at home. It's an Australian hand axe of the kind used by Homo erectus 500,000 years ago, although my wife actually got this one on eBay for me. And next to it sits an object of exactly the same size and shape. And between those two objects, we've got the whole history of humankind, right? We've gone from making one to making the other. How did we do that, and why? And why in this time period? And what's the difference between them? That's the sort of big picture of where we're going. And if we needed reminding of the importance of innovation, the pandemic has certainly done that for us, because innovative vaccines of an entirely new design called the messenger RNA vaccines are what is basically getting us out of this mess. They were developed far faster than vaccines had ever been developed before. It's a fantastic breakthrough, and the person who deserves the most credit for it is probably this woman on the right, Katalin Karikó, who was researching the idea of using messenger RNA as medicines for 20, 30 years, and she couldn't make it work, and she failed again and again. She lost her grants, she got demoted, all sorts of things went wrong in her life. And then this guy on the left, Drew Weissman, helped her and put together a new idea with her, and between them, they suddenly began to make it work. They thought they were going to try and cure cancer, but then the pandemic came along and the technology was readapted to making the Moderna and the Pfizer vaccines that are the ones that got to the starting line fastest. So it's a wonderful story of the importance of innovation right now, right here in the world. And they stood in the footsteps of other pioneers. These two women developed the first whooping cough vaccine in the 1930s. They weren't doctors, they were medical technicians working in Wisconsin, and in 4 years flat, they developed a very effective and safe vaccine for whooping cough. It was an extraordinary story. But 4 years to develop a vaccine would be good going today. We didn't manage to speed up this technology much until really this last year. And of course, the story of vaccines actually goes way further back than that. Edward Jenner in England in the 1780s was the first person who started giving kids cowpox so that they wouldn't die of smallpox. The Latin name for cowpox is vaccinia. That's where the word comes from. But even that's not the beginning of the story. Go back to the early 1700s. A slave in Boston by the name of Onesimus tells his master, who's a preacher called Cotton Mather, you know, back in Africa, we give kids a little bit of smallpox from somebody who survived from a mild case, and that protects them in later life. So you can actually, it's more dangerous than vaccination, but you can actually inoculate people with the same disease if you're careful. He told Zabdiel Boylston, a medical professor, he inoculated a bunch of students at Harvard because there was an epidemic of smallpox ripping through Boston at the time. And that made Boylston extremely unpopular. All the medical professionals and everyone said this is an outrageously stupid and dangerous thing to do. How dare you do it? But it's the beginning of inoculation, which led to vaccination, which led to what we've got today. So there's a long prehistory often behind breakthroughs that happen today. And what has that done to the world, developing things like vaccines? Well, it's the reason we have seen incredible improvements in our living standards. I mean, look what's happened to child mortality in roughly my lifetime. This is the greatest measure of misery anybody can think of, having to bury a child. There's nothing worse. And fewer people have to do it. And that's because of vaccination and hygiene and better nutrition and all these other things. So it's because of innovation in a world. So it's an incredibly important topic. And I just want to remind you, if you're younger than me, which all of you are, that although a lot of people are very pessimistic about the future at the moment, they always have been. When I was young, the population explosion was unstoppable and famine was inevitable, pollution was going to get worse. The grown-ups told me nothing optimistic at all about the future. These are some of the best-selling books of the early 1970s. A book called Famine 1975 said that the famines now approaching will last for years, perhaps several decades, and they are for a surety inevitable. Another best-selling book, an even better seller, called The Population Bomb. The battle to feed all of humanity is over. In the 1970s, hundreds of millions of people will starve to death in spite of any crash programs embarked upon now. There's nothing we can do about it. It's going to happen. Robert Heilbronner, an economist, the outlook for man is painful, desperate, and the hope that can be held out for his future seems to be very slim indeed. No wonder I was kind of depressed about the world as a student reading this kind of stuff. What actually happened? Well, in population terms, the growth rate of the world population halved in my lifetime, from 2% to 1%. We now think the world population is not even going to double in the 21st century, whereas it quadrupled in the 20th century. And as for famine, what happened to famine? Did those terrible famines happen? Did millions of people die in the 1970s and onwards? Lots of people were dying in mass starvation events in every decade in the 20th century up until that point. It looked like it was going to get worse. The population was getting bigger. Where's the food going to come from? What happened to famine? That's what happened to famine. Famine went extinct. Famine doesn't happen nowadays. Sure, there is still poverty, there is still starvation and so on, but mass starvation events just don't happen anymore. And that's because of, in a word, innovation. Innovation in agriculture, but innovation in trade and other things as well. And by the way, when I was young, I didn't ever expect to see great whales. I was told they were about to go extinct. There were 5,000 humpback whales left in the world in 1965. There's now 80,000. The numbers have gone shooting up. I've seen them all over the world. We're now seeing them again in large aggregations. And one of the reasons is because we don't need to pursue them and eat them because we're getting enough food from other sources. So we can begin to spare nature as well. So that's just a little glimpse of what innovation can do for us. Just in terms of poverty, the most striking one, half the world lived on less than $2 a day when I was born. Today, less than 10%. And this is in sheer contradiction to what people like the United Nations were saying was going to happen. So do, if you get a chance, tell your friends and other people that there is a possibility that the future will be better than the past if we indulge in innovation. It's not guaranteed, but it's at least possible. And it's because of innovation. So what does innovation do? It doesn't just give us new widgets. It brings down the price of fulfilling a need. It makes it easier to fulfill, to feed yourself or clothe yourself or entertain yourself or something like that. Think of this very, very simple technology, artificial light. That's a necessity. Everybody needs artificial light. Everybody has access to it. Even poor people have access to it, right? Well, that wasn't the case for most of human history. It was once a luxury. The price of artificial light has come down and down and down over the last few centuries in the most spectacular fashion. It's so that it's now available to pretty well everybody whenever they want. And if you measure it in terms of time, it's even more striking. How long would you have to work on the average wage to be able to afford an hour of light from an ordinary lamp? And the answer is about a third of a second from an LED bulb, okay? A third of a second's work will give you an hour of light. Back in 1950, your grandparents would have had to work for 8 seconds, which is significantly more, but it's not a big deal, really. In 1880, 15 minutes. Quite a lot of time. 1800, a tallow candle, 6 hours for 1 hour of light. The average person could not afford a candle in 1800. Thomas Jefferson could afford a candle, but most people couldn't at that time. So one of the things that innovation does is it equalizes. It makes technologies that were once the preserve of the rich available to everybody. And where's this coming from? What are the causes of innovation? Well, I'm going to go through some of them, but one of them, I think, is energy. You need to put energy into the systems of the world in order to get useful things out. That's basically the second law of thermodynamics, that essentially if you want structures that are improbable but useful, like this thing in my hand, it's not random, it's not it's not a natural phenomenon, then you have to make it with energy. And so the more energy we made available in the Industrial Revolution over the last 200 years, the more we speeded up innovation. That's one of the underlying factors. And look where all that energy came from. Nearly all of it came from 3 sources: gas, oil, and coal. And we're about to try and do without those in the next century, which we might achieve. I don't know. It's up to you guys to innovate and make it possible. But it's quite a tall order, replacing those 3. And we're going to need that much energy if we're to keep innovating, I think. Now, I think innovation is not the same thing as invention. It includes invention, obviously, but inventing a new prototype is only half the battle. The other half is getting people to use it, making it affordable, available, and reliable so that people will actually want to use it and can use it. And this is rather nicely illustrated, I think, in a story that Charles Townes used to tell, the inventor of the laser. He said, there's a beaver and a rabbit looking at the Hoover Dam. And the beaver says to the rabbit, no, I didn't build it, but it is based on an idea of mine. And you find that again and again in the story of innovation. You find people saying, well, come on, this is all my idea. And you say, well, yeah, but actually an awful lot of work had to go into making it something useful for people, So I invented the internet. Well, I'm not sure. I think a lot of us invented the internet, actually, et cetera, et cetera. So it's worth emphasizing the unsung heroes who turn stuff into useful devices, as well as the ones we build statues to, who came up with the idea in the first place. Innovation is a very serendipitous process. That is to say, there's a lot of luck involved. Innovators always talk about the importance of changing direction, if necessary, of stumbling upon things that you didn't expect to. Art Fry was working at 3M in Minneapolis. He was trying to invent a permanent glue for paper, and he failed. He came up with this stuff that worked as a temporary glue, but it just didn't stay stuck. You could pick it off any time you wanted. And then he thought, hang on, I'm going to choir practice tonight. I need to keep my place in my hymn book. This could be quite useful. And that was the birth of the Post-it note, which is a really useful technology, nice and low tech, nothing very highfalutin about it. Stephanie Kwolek, working at DuPont, came up with a substance that turned out to be useful in bulletproof vests, which was not what she was expecting. So you've got to be alert as an innovator to changing direction halfway through your project. And innovation is also more gradual than we think. We think of these sudden breakthroughs that happen when the internet or something like that disrupts our lives, or the mobile telephone comes along and changes the way the world works. But always behind these revolutionary changes in the world, there is an evolutionary gradual phenomenon. There's much more incremental, steady improvement in the technology than we recognize. Moore's law describes the steady improvement in computing over the period after the invention of the transistor. But as Ray Kurzweil points out on this chart, Moore's law actually goes back all the way through previous technologies in the whole of the 20th century, so that the last of the transistors was not that much worse than the first of, sorry, the last of the vacuum tubes was not that much worse than the first of the transistors. So there's a sort of steady march upward of these things. It doesn't go in leaps and bounds. We think of leaps and bounds in innovation, but actually that's misleading. Under the surface, there's always a much more gradual process, in my view. It's not just gradual, it's actually evolutionary. Machines evolve, and they evolve in much the same way that animals evolve, actually. They show descent with modification, family trees. The mobile phone evolved to be smaller and smaller, and then it evolved to be bigger and bigger again. Who knows why? It just did. And when you think about it, it's a phenomenon very like natural selection. I flew here at the weekend from London on a 787, the latest Boeing aircraft. And it was designed, I presume, by a very intelligent designer, a brilliant engineer. But he didn't start from scratch, did he? He started with a 777 and improved it. And so on, all the way back to the Wright brothers in 1903. And what happened at every step along the way was that good ideas were kept and improved upon and bad ideas were dropped. So for example, in the early 1950s, jet airliners had square windows. And then they kept crashing, and somebody pointed out that metal fatigue starts at the corner of the square, so now jet engines have slightly rounded windows. That's an idea that had to be kept on, and another one's dropped. So it's very like natural selection, the process behind biological evolution. And biological evolution tends to work by combining and recombining genes to get new combinations. And the way you do that is through sexual reproduction. You get two individuals to contribute genes to the next generation, and sometimes you get interesting new combinations as a result. It's called recombination. Exactly the same thing happens with our technologies. We combine and recombine technologies and processes to produce new ones. This is my favorite example of that. It's called the pill camera. You swallow it, it takes a picture of your insides for the doctor to see. And it came about after a conversation over a garden fence between a gastroenterologist and a guided missile designer. Now that's what I call ideas having sex, if you see what I mean. And what this recombination phenomenon reminds us is that we live in a world which is immensely collaborative. We live in a network of people contributing ideas to other people all the time. And not just ideas, but stuff too. I mean, most of the stuff we make comes from this process of collaboration. There's a wonderful essay written in the 1950s, some of you will have read it, called I, Pencil by Leonard Read, and it's written by a pencil. The pencil wants to discover where it came from. So it does a lot of research, and it eventually concludes that its ancestry is very complicated, because there was a guy cutting down a tree whose wood was going to be used to make the wood of the pencil. And there was someone else mining graphite, whose graphite was going to be used in the lead of the pencil. And then there were people driving trucks who were bringing these products to the factory, and people working in the factory. And then there was someone growing coffee, whose coffee was being drunk by the people in the factory, and so on. When he gets to the end of the book, the end of the essay, the pencil concludes that there are 1 million people involved in making one pencil. And the weird thing is, not one of them knows how to make a pencil. I mean, the person in the factory doesn't know how to make a pencil, he just knows how to work in the factory. He doesn't know how to cut down a tree or to make coffee or mine graphite. The knowledge of how to make a pencil, really quite a simple object, exists between our heads, not within our heads. It's held in the cloud. And this is true of almost everything we use and we make. And what it tells us is that innovation has to be a process of collaboration. It cannot work if we try and do it on our own. And the reason I think that it happens to us and not to rabbits or rocks is because we human beings exchange. We swap, we trade, we love it. deep in our psyches to do deals with each other, to find ways of collaborating. Every society that's ever been contacted knows about trade. The archaeological evidence for trade goes back 100,000 years, 10 times as far as agriculture. And yet, if you try and teach trade to another animal, it's just almost impossible. You cannot get a chimpanzee to get the point of, you've got all the grapes, he's got all the carrots, do a deal and you can both have both. They just don't get it. Or as Adam Smith famously said, no man ever saw a dog make fair and deliberate exchange of a bone with another dog. So I think this peculiar human habit of exchange is absolutely central to the phenomenon of innovation. And if you don't collaborate, you won't make a good innovator. This was beautifully illustrated 120 years ago by a man named Samuel Langley. He was a brilliant man. He was the head of the Smithsonian Institution in Washington. He was an astrophysicist, and he decided that he knew how to make an aeroplane. And he went to the US government and said, give me $25,000 and I'll make you the first aeroplane. And they gave him $25,000 and he went off in secret, didn't talk to anyone. His project was guarded from other people in case they found out what he was up to. And then he unveiled it one day in December 1903 on top of a houseboat on the Potomac River. And as you can see from the picture, it went in the wrong direction. It went straight into the water. And the government was furious and Langley was humiliated. And 10 days later, on an island off North Carolina, two bicycle mechanics from Dayton, Ohio, without a degree between them, succeeded where Langley had failed and got a powered machine into the air. And what they had done right that Langley had done wrong is that they had picked the brains of anybody and everybody who was thinking about flight. They, particularly through a guy called Octave Chanute in Chicago, they had drawn upon a network of people all over the world, in Australia and Europe and everywhere, who'd been studying kites and box kites and gliders and birds and wind tunnels and aerofoils, and endless experiments had been done everywhere. And the Wright brothers didn't pretend to be cleverer than anyone else. They just said, wherever anyone's doing anything, we're going to learn from it. And then they did a ton of experiments themselves. They did 3 years of experiments at Kitty Hawk with gliders before they even tried to put an engine on one of them, so that they could work out exactly what curvature their aerofoils should have, exactly how you steered a machine in the air and things like this. So they did an immense amount of trial and error. And trial and error, it comes up again and again if you talk to innovators. If you talk to smart people who know how to do innovation, they go on and on about the importance of trying and then making an error, failing, and then having to start again. So Jeff Bezos, for example, talks about swinging and missing. And you can tell the story of Amazon as a story of failure after failure. You know, Amazon got everything wrong. It went into toys at the wrong time. It bought a bunch of businesses in the dot-com boom and they all failed. You know, Amazon did everything wrong, and yet it did everything right as well, because it did wrong stuff and it did right stuff, and it able to stick with the right stuff. So it became an immensely successful company. Here's Thomas Edison making the same point. I haven't failed, I've just found 10,000 ways that don't work. It's rather a nice way of putting it. Now, when Edison came to choose the material for the filament of his first light bulb, he tried 6,000, well, I say he tried, he got his staff to try 6,000 different types of plant material before he settled on a particular kind of Japanese bamboo. He was not going to be satisfied with the second best. He absolutely had to find the best material to work for the filament of his light bulb. That's the importance of trial and error. Talking of light bulbs, there's a really odd phenomenon here, which is that Edison invented the light bulb, but so did Joseph Swan in England, so did Lodygin in Russia, so did Hiram Maxim. In fact, there are 21 different people who can lay claim to have invented the light bulb independently in the 1870s or thereabouts. It's very odd. Why should that be? This turns out to be quite a common phenomenon. Kevin Kelly, in his book What Technology Wants, describes just how common simultaneous invention is. The thermometer, the jet engine, the telephone. There are people saying, hang on a minute, I invented that. How come he's getting the credit? And they're often right. They did invent it separately. So what's going on? Why does this happen? Well, it's not because the gods lean down from the clouds and implant the idea of the light bulb in 21 different heads around the world. It can't be that. It's just that the technologies that go into making a light bulb had reached the point where it was inevitable people would put them together. The idea was ripe. It was ready to go. And so if Edison gets run over by a tram, or trolley, I should say, you still get light bulbs. You know, you can't stop it being invented, which is rather a strange idea because it makes innovation seem completely inevitable, you know, that it's going to happen whatever happens. Think of a more recent example, the search engine. The most useful innovation of my lifetime, bar none, I think. I use it every day. I can't imagine life without it. I can't remember life without it. It came into existence around 1990. Google wasn't the first. They were just the one who scooped the pool. So if Sergey Brin and Larry Page had not met each other, we'd still have search engines. Lots of other companies invented search engines around the same time. And once you'd invented the internet, it was inevitable that people would invent a search engine so you could navigate your way through the internet. But did anyone in the 1980s say, ooh, hang on, once we get this internet thing up and running, someone's going to make a ton of money out of search engines? Nope, nobody did. People didn't see search coming. They didn't see the importance of it either commercially or even technologically. I mean, Larry Page and Sergey Brin did not think they were inventing a search engine. They thought they were cataloging the internet. It only slowly dawned on them that they'd invented the most lucrative way of making money out of the internet. So innovation is both inevitable at certain times and certain places and unpredictable. That's a bit of a paradox. And it's one that I haven't completely solved, I'm free to admit. I don't fully understand how to resolve that. I've got some ideas, but I haven't quite worked out how to tackle it. And just to remind you just how unpredictable technology is, here are three really, really clever people saying really, really stupid things about the future of technology. So Ken Olsen was the chairman of Digital Equipment Corporation, which made the mini computers, the most successful computers of the 1970s, the smallest ones. And here he is saying, in 1977, there is no reason anyone would want a computer in their own home. But he makes smaller computers than IBM, and yet he still can't see that coming. Here's Paul Krugman, the Nobel Prize-winning economist, 1998. By 2005, it'll become clear that the internet's impact on the economy will be no greater than the fax machines. Got that one wrong. And Steve Ballmer, the chief executive of Microsoft, 2007, there is no chance the iPhone's going to get significant market share. No chance. So it's very hard to see round the corner and see what's coming next in technology, even though there's something inevitable about it. I find that rather intriguing. Not everybody gets the future wrong. Here's a picture from the 1920s, drawn in Germany, and it shows exactly what the future looks like, because that's what we're doing today, I think, anyway. One of the reasons for it being so unpredictable is what I call the Amara hype cycle. Roy Amara was a computer scientist in California in the 1960s who said that we underestimate the impact of a new technology in the long run, but we overestimate it in the short run. So it's not linear, the way we adopt a technology. It's more like S-shaped. It's very disappointing for the first 10 years. That's what Paul Krugman meant when he thought the internet was disappointing. But then suddenly it takes off. I think it's safe to say the internet is no longer disappointing. I think most people would agree. Genomics, go back 20 years and look what Bill Clinton said at the unveiling of the first human genome. We should have cured cancer by now. Huge things were expected of it. It hasn't quite delivered yet, but I think it's about to, because I think messenger RNA vaccines, CRISPR gene editing, things like that are really going to take off in the next few years. AI, the self-driving cars, things like that, I'm not convinced they're going to come quite as quickly as we think. So I suspect we haven't quite reached the takeoff point for some of those technologies. And as for crypto, well, there's a lot of disappointing still to come, I think. But that doesn't mean that it's not going to make an incredible contribution later in the century. That's one way of resolving the paradox between unpredictability and inevitability in innovation. Innovation doesn't happen in all sectors at all times at the same rate. That's quite an important point. We tend to think, oh, it's all speeding up. It's not actually. Previous generations lived through much faster changes in some technologies than we're living through. I mean, take transport, for example. My grandparents in the first half of the 20th century lived through incredible changes in transport. They saw the first motor cars, the first aeroplanes, the first helicopters, the first space travel in their lifetimes. Yet they saw very little change in computing and communication. The telephone was around when they were born and the telephone was around when they died. Whereas I've had the opposite experience. I've lived through almost no changes in transport at all. I mean, sure, there are more cup holders in cars and there's drones in the air and, the planes crash less often than they did when I was young. But, they haven't got faster. In fact, they've got slower because of all the time they spend in congested airports and things like that. So it's not, there's been, the transport revolution disappeared. If you go back to 1950 and see what people are saying about the future, they go on and on about transport. They talk about routine space travel and personal jetpacks and all this kind of stuff, none of which happened. They don't talk about email and mobile phones and things like that, which is what happened. I lived through an electronics revolution, whereas my grandparents lived through a transport revolution. And that implies to me that the next 50 years may not be about electronics. In other words, we might be sitting here thinking, oh, it's all going to be AI and crypto and things like that. That might run out of road. And actually, the next 50 years is all about biotechnology. It's all about CRISPR and messenger RNA and things like that. That's my guess. But then my guess is no better than those three guys who I was rude about a minute ago. Here's a picture from the 1950s of the future. This is the year 2000. Here's a mailman delivering letters, ordinary letters. So we haven't invented email, but he's got a rocket strapped to his back. Okay. See, it gets it exactly the wrong way around, the futurology. And we're probably getting futurology the wrong way around now. The relationship between science and technology, between discovery and invention, is nothing like as simple as we tend to think. The view of politicians is that you put money in at one end of the pipe called science, and you get technology out the other end of the pipe. And that's called the linear model. And for 50 years, economists and others have been saying it doesn't actually work like that. It quite often goes the other way, or it goes both ways. So here's the two people who won the Nobel Prize last year for CRISPR, the gene editing technology, Jennifer Doudna and Emmanuel Charpentier. Fantastic discovery, brilliant work, done in universities, academic scientists, right? Now that's now going out into industry and turning into a useful technology in medicine and agriculture and other things. Standard linear story. But actually, they were building upon discoveries made in the yogurt industry by Philippe Horvath and others, working in the yogurt industry. What's so special about the yogurt industry? Well, it depends upon bacteria. You have to, you make yogurt with bacteria. Bacteria sometimes get sick. When they get sick, it's because they've caught viruses. So scientists in the yogurt industry studied diseases of bacteria, and they had worked out that bacteria have these extraordinary genetic sequences tucked away in their genomes, which are repetitive sequences, which are viral genomes. They are libraries of virus genomes, so they can spot viruses when they come in. And that's this highly recognizable technology is exactly what had been adapted to make the CRISPR tool. But where did Philippe Horvath get it? He got it from a university guy called Francisco Mojica, who was studying bacteria at Algeciras, and he found these strange sequences but didn't know what they were for. He didn't realize that they were libraries of viral sequences. He couldn't understand why these repetitive reversed sequences were in bacterial genomes. So here's a story that starts in universities, goes into industry, goes back into universities, comes back into industry. That's much more typical of the relationship between science and technology, in my view. I won't go into this in depth because it would take too long, but we keep saying that innovation is going to destroy jobs, and it doesn't. It destroys some jobs, but it creates others. We've been saying this since the threshing machines of the 1820s. We were saying it in the 60s about computers in factories. We're saying it today about AI. It's not going to be true. Yes, we can work shorter hours and spend a longer time in education and retirement than we used to as a result of technology. But no, we're not going to see mass unemployment as a result of it. Nor is innovation going to run out of room because we run out of resources, in my view. In fact, I think innovation is potentially infinite on this planet. Now, that might seem a strange thing to say, because you hear people say you can't have infinite economic growth on a finite planet. You'll run out of resources eventually. But actually, half the time what the innovator is doing is saying, I've found a way to achieve the same end with fewer resources. I've found a way to actually shrink the number of resources you need. And if you could, in theory, do that pretty well forever. So one of the main resources that we need to worry about is land. How to not use too much of it to produce enough food to feed people. Look what happened when synthetic nitrogen fertilizer in particular, but also other technologies began to be used in farming. You decoupled the amount of food you could get from the amount of area. So the amount of land devoted to growing corn in the United States is not much different from what it was in 1900, but the yield is about 10 times as much. And that's because of technology. So if you average all crops grown for food in the world, according to their contribution to human diet, you find that we use 68% less land than we did in 1960 to produce a given amount of food. Thank goodness we did that, because if we hadn't done that, 7.5 billion people trying to live off the yields of 1960 would not only result in mass starvation, but also mean that we wouldn't have room for rainforests or anything else. So that's the phenomenon, innovation in agriculture, that is doing most to save nature. And it's got a long way to go yet. Indoor farming is a new phenomenon. Lettuces and herbs are being grown indoors on a mass scale because of LED lights, basically. That's the technology that's made the difference there. These low energy, low heat lights mean that you can have multi-story farms inside old factories and things like that, producing roughly 300 times as much lettuce from an acre as we did before. We think innovation's popular. We all love it, don't we? Except I'm not sure we do. Wherever innovation happens, there is a surprising amount of resistance to it. I mean, think of the story of genetically modified crops in Europe, which this is 20 years ago in Britain, protesters pulling up crops because they're genetically modified. In effect, an entire continent turned its back on an entire technology because it thought it might be dangerous. We now know it's not dangerous, but that was the obsession of the time. And there's nothing new about this. It goes back a long way. Here's a New York Times article about Thomas Edison in the 1870s. Something ought to be done to Mr. Edison, and there is a growing conviction it had better be done with a hemp rope. Mr. Edison has invented too many things, and almost without exception, they are things of the most deleterious character. I thought this was sarcastic when I first read it, but it turns out it's not. You know, these people really did, just think he was spoiling the world with all these damned innovations which shouldn't be allowed. And in fact, it goes back even further. When coffee was first introduced into Western Europe, there was huge resistance to it. It was banned almost everywhere. It was banned for two reasons. One, because the wine and beer industry wanted it banned, so there was competition here. And they hired medics to write pamphlets saying this thing's dangerous, it's bad for you, this coffee stuff. Dries up your liver and poisons your kidneys. I mean, all sorts of, pseudo-medical arguments which turned out to be nonsense. But the other reason for banning coffee was because people went to coffee houses. And when they went to coffee houses, they had conversations. And when they had conversations, they sometimes talked about whether the king was doing a good job or not. And sometimes they concluded that he wasn't. And this can't be allowed. I mean, look, here's King Charles II banning coffee in the whole of London in the 1670s. As for coffee, tea and chocolate, I know no good they do. Only the places where they're sold are convenient for persons to meet in, sit half day and discourse with all companies that come in of state matters, talking of news and broaching of lies, arraigning the judgments and discretions of their governors, censuring all their actions and insinuating into the ears of the people a prejudice against them, extolling and magnifying their own parts, and so on. So we mustn't have coffee because it leads to fake news, basically. Now, it didn't work. Coffee just kept coming back again and again, and eventually they stopped trying to ban it. And as you know, we do have coffee today. But whether it's umbrellas or recorded music or whatever, the introduction of a new technology is always resisted by some section of society. So it's quite important to remember that innovation requires freedom. People have to overcome these resistances, and they have to have a chance to do all these different things. They have to be able to experiment, to do trial and error, to fail, if you like, and sit back up and start again. If you're not in a position to do this, you're not allowed to do this, then it's not going to happen. To collaborate with other people, to choose who you want to collaborate with, that's vitally important. To change direction, to see the opportunity where you didn't expect to see it, to back your ideas, to invest in them, and to act fast, to do things quickly. Those are the essential ingredients of an innovative society, in my view. And you find them in trading societies, but in societies that are not really, that are decentralized, that are sort of city-states in Renaissance Italy or Song China or the Low Countries in the Netherlands or Victorian England or Silicon Valley more recently. And you don't get that kind of freedom inside big companies to the same extent. They're top-down organizations which tell you what to do. They don't give you the chance to change direction, to experiment, and so on. So Kodak was blown away by digital photography. It knew about it. It even invented a version of digital photography. But it was so invested in film that it just couldn't change direction. Nokia went from being a very small company to being the biggest mobile phone company in the world by a huge margin in the 1990s and looked immensely successful. But because it got stuck with voice and it didn't think about data, it was completely blindsided by the smartphone revolution, and it died it didn't quite die, but it shrank to a very small company. It's not just big companies that are bad at innovation. Big countries are bad at innovation. Empires ought to be great for innovation. They're huge free trade zones with a lot of free movement in them, with a lot of brilliant people and scholars and so on, and a lot of money. But, whether it's the Ming Empire, the Ottoman Empire, the Roman Empire, the Arabian Empire, they produce remarkably few innovations. In fact, they're often very resistant to innovation. The Song dynasty in China was a striking exception. Why? Because it was a very, very innovative time, about 1,000 years ago, because it wasn't really an empire at all. It was a federation of city-states, effectively, and that's why it was so innovative. Talking of China, it's an innovative country today, has been particularly for the last 20 years. How does that fit with my theory that you need a lot of freedom? Because China's not a very free place. Well, the way politicians interpret what's going on in China in the West is they say, yes, the Chinese have brilliant industrial strategy. They pick winners. They decide to invest in certain technologies. And the result is innovation. I'm not sure that's right. I think that's a misreading of China. I think what's happened in China is that there is zero political freedom, but there's quite a lot of economic freedom, or at least there has been. If you want to set up a business and start and do something, there are very few of the sort of rules and regulators who slow you down and stop you doing it that you would normally encounter in the West. As long as you're not annoying the Communist Party, you can do all sorts of different things. And that's coming to an end, I think. I think Xi Jinping's policies are less helpful to economic freedom as well as political freedom than his immediate predecessors. Talking of China, I, as I say, wrote this book during the pandemic. Then all these lockdowns happened and I'm stuck at home. And I got very interested in the topic of where this virus came from. And eventually I started collaborating with a brilliant young molecular biologist at Harvard called Alina Chan. And in 2 weeks' time, our book on the origin of the virus comes out. And I'm not yet allowed to talk about it by the publisher. But if you're interested, I can say a few things about it in the Q&A. And if you're even more interested, in a couple of weeks, you can buy it. And it's a fascinating story. We don't claim to have solved it, but there is, it's an incredibly important question. We've seen millions of people die and hundreds of millions of people have their lives disrupted by a virus. And we need to know where it came from and how it started, if only to make sure that it doesn't happen again. And with that, I'll stop and I'll be only too happy to take questions. Thank you very much.
To start off, thank you for the presentation. It was very informative. I'm just curious, just based off of some of the greatest minds right now, like Elon Musk, who's been kind of alluding to integrating technology with the human body. Do you see that as more of like kind of just blabbling, or is that like a serious innovation, optimization of our species, like either in this century or the next? I just wanted your opinion on that.
Yeah, I don't know the answer, actually. I think it's an interesting one. I mean, on the one hand, I think it's absolutely right to see artificial intelligence augmenting human intelligence rather than competing with it. If you look at what we've done with, sat-nav or something like that, or parking assist, these are AIs. They are artificial intelligences, and they're not used to make, a sort of rival version of intelligence to human beings that will compete with us. They're used to augment and assist us. And so I think if you think about the technology fusing with the human body, it's in that spirit, and in that sense, it's right. And this is a technology that assists me to see. But whether or not it's going to be easy to combine silicon-based technologies with wet carbon-based technologies like the human brain, I have my doubts. I think there are going to be some wonderful medical possibilities with implants for things like Parkinson's and so on. So I think that's where it'll start. But we've already got runners, people who've got artificial limbs running faster sometimes than people with non-artificial limbs. So there's clearly something there, but I would put that in the actual use of sort of merging of bodies and machines. I would put that quite far down the Amara hype curve. I think it's got quite a long way to go still. But let's watch this space.
Let me take the moderator's privilege to ask a question. You mentioned China. One of the things that has been surprising to me anyway over the last 5 to 10 years is a kind of a increase in enthusiasm for old-style industrial policy of the kind that many people, as you pointed out, mistakenly think is present in China. The British academic Mariana Mazzucato has become very well known for making this argument that a lot of the innovations that you've talked about, while indeed there was, important roles were played certainly by private actors, it was really the public sector, it was the state that was responsible for the fundamental underlying breakthroughs that the free enterprise system can then sort of grab and develop further. What are your thoughts on the role of public investment and in particular with reference to the sorts of examples that Mazzucato uses, like the internet, GPS, biotechnology, and so forth?
Yeah, exactly. Well, in one sense, the government takes half my money off me, so I'm quite glad if it puts some of that back into innovation. I wouldn't want it sort of just, the government gets so much money that if it spent none of that on innovation, it would be a mistake. So it's a huge player in innovation through universities, but also in other ways. And yes, inevitably, it has made a huge contribution to innovation, whether you think it's through nuclear weapons in World War II or DARPA and the internet. But I think Mariana is quite often making the mistake of crediting the beaver with the Hoover Dam here, because when she says the government invented the internet and it should get all the credit for that, and it wouldn't have happened without. Yes, the original idea of networked computers was pioneered within DARPA, but actually it only really took off when those scientists left DARPA and went out and started firms in Silicon Valley. And then a whole bunch of stuff happened that involved learning by doing and expanding the scale of stuff. And the internet evolved in a massive way, in a free private sector way. And everybody and nobody invented the internet in that sense. And I think that's true of a lot of the examples she uses, that yes, you can identify seed funding. And she sometimes uses examples that really don't make the point that she's trying to make. So she talks about plasma screen technologies coming out of a publicly funded PhD at some university somewhere. Well, yeah, but that's only just the start of it. And anyway, the publicly funded PhD stumbled upon that technology as a sort of surprise. It was a serendipity thing. It's a matter of emphasis. But do I think the government gets too much? Does she think the government doesn't get enough credit for all the technologies we use? That's her view. Do I think they get slightly too much credit? That's my view, if you see what I mean.
You mentioned how you don't think that there's going to be mass job loss due to AI and innovation in that space, and you compared it to previous industrial revolutions. How is it not completely different? Because from what I've seen, the few things that I've read about is how in previous revolutions, innovation has optimized human work, but now it's being completely replaced by AI and automation. So how is this industrial revolution not necessarily unique?
Yeah, I don't agree with your premise, actually, because if you think about agriculture, in order to feed the human population 200 years ago, 80% of the human population had to be growing food, had to be out there hoeing the fields every day. And we went from that to what, 2%, 1% of the population is farmers today. So that, and the rest are just not involved in growing food at all. So that was a massive replacement of people by machines, an even bigger one, if you like, than what we're talking about today. So in that sense, I think the previous revolutions were just as enormous in their implications. And also, again, going back to this point about augmenting human intelligence with AI, I see AI helping physicians to become more productive when they diagnose cancers or something. So it's, it gives them a quicker and more accurate way of delineating a cancer on a radiograph or whatever it might be, rather than doing the cancer doctor out of a job altogether. And if his price comes down because he's more productive, then there can be more of him, or he can employ more assistants or something. So that's how I see it working in the future, perhaps. Just think of all the professions, though, that didn't exist 150 years ago. That you know, if a Victorian was in the room now and you started using words like flight attendant or software engineer, they wouldn't know what on earth you were talking about. So these AIs are also going to create their own jobs that go with them. There's a little bit of middle-class snobbery here. For the first time, technology is starting to threaten the jobs of lawyers and doctors. You know, we won't. You know, it's not a problem when it's factory workers, but oh, are they coming after my job? I don't like the sound of that. I think. I don't know.
As you were saying earlier about the kind of invention of the light bulb by Edison, how there was like 20-some people who all thought of the same idea. Have we reached a point where like no idea or innovation is like purely unique, and rather it's opportunity that creates innovation?
If you invent a light bulb, you're in competition with others to invent it, and someone else is going to invent it. That's kind of the implication of what I'm saying. Whereas if you write Hamlet or you paint the Mona Lisa, that's not going to happen. And I think that's quite an interesting in contrast. But obviously it can't be true that, you know, you rerun the tape of history and you always get light bulbs in New Jersey in 1878. You know, it's not going to be like that, is it? You know, it's not that deterministic, clearly. And people do matter. You know, Edison did try 6,000 different types of plant material. Lodygin in Russia didn't. You know, so Edison made a better version of the light bulb. So clearly it's some interesting combination between individual initiative and genius, if you like. Kevin Kelly in his book talks about simultaneous scientific discovery as well, which is a surprisingly common phenomenon too, that, you know, Darwin and Wallace came up with the idea of evolution by natural selection at the same time. And then he says things like, well, what about special relativity? If Einstein hadn't lived, how long would it have taken us to come up with the idea of special relativity? And you can persuade yourself that Einstein was so clever that we might never have figured that out, or at least in a different order. But actually, if you look at Hendrik Lorentz's notebooks, he was easily halfway there already. He'd probably have got there. So I think that the way to think about the inevitability thing is that sometime around 2035, when you're in your prime, somebody will work out a way to bring back extinct species, mammoths or something like that. I'm just plucking that one out of the air. And given that that's going to happen, you might as well make sure it's you that does it. How about that as a way of thinking of it? There's a challenge.
I have a bit of an unfair question, or hopefully you like this question. Let's say you were in charge of everything. If you could make one change to help innovation, what would you do? Would you, I don't know, lower top tax rates? Would you force everyone in the world who wanted to work on autonomous vehicles to move to Silicon Valley so they'd be together? Or what kind of thing would you be thinking of if you could change one thing?
Depends what you mean by one thing. But yeah, the answer I'm giving to the UK government, which I do give some advice to on innovation at the moment, is that the problem with regulators is not that they say no to innovators, it's that they take too long to say yes. So it's to speed up. I would wave my magic wand and speed up decision making. And just to give you an example of that in action, Britain has left the European Union. You may have heard that news. And one of the UK agencies is called the Medicines and Healthcare Regulatory Agency, equivalent to the FDA here. And its job is to approve new medications or whatever. And they actually said around the time of Brexit, we don't like Brexit, but we do admit that actually the European Medicines Agency just adds 6 months of delay to our decisions, frankly. You know, we could do things much quicker. And one of the ways we could do them quicker is by taking decisions in parallel, not in sequence. So if there are 6 tests you want a vaccine to go through, let's start all 6 at the same time rather than waiting till it's past 1 before we do 2, and so on. It's not quite that simple, but that's the sort of basic setup. And we're beginning to experiment with that, and we'll be able to do more of it after Brexit. Now, when the vaccines came along last year, they did exactly that. And they beat the European Medicines Agency and the FDA to safe approval of the first vaccines by quite a significant margin, by a couple of months. And that was a huge benefit to the UK to be the first to approve these vaccines. So it's a very clear example of how speed matters. If you invent a new medical implant, on average in the US it takes you about 4 years to get it approved. In Europe about 6 years. If you invent a new video game, 6 weeks, 6 days, I don't know, 6 hours. So we must be diverting entrepreneurial energy into video games and away from medical implants, which is a pity, because actually they're quite useful, medical implants. And so just to get, when I'm dictator, to get my underlings to realize that speed matters in government decisions because it determines where entrepreneurial energy goes is, I think, the one thing I would say.